The seal on Archive Crate 7 broke on a Tuesday, which was not supposed to happen for another 40 years. I know the exact day because I logged it, the way I logged everything. That was my function. Halvard Osin, Archivist 3rd Tier. Commission for the Preservation of Interstellar Historical Record. Not a diplomat, not a soldier. Not anyone the Sovereignty Commission would remember when they assembled at midday to vote on the formal exile of Earth from the interstellar community. I was the man in the basement cataloging the dead. I was also, as it turned out, the only one in the building that day who had read the warnings they left behind, and the only one who understood, when I finished reading them, that there was no time left to wait for the right meeting to say so. Crate 7 had come in with the rest of the Vethrani hegemony's final records. 6 months prior, 38 crates, acid-sealed, stamped with the three-pronged emblem of a civilization that no longer existed. The Vethrani were gone. Their home system had been swallowed by a stellar expansion event 200 years ago. But their bureaucracy had outlasted them the way bureaucracies do, maintained by 3 success species who inherited the filing obligations along with the debt. The records arrived in good order. Crates 1 through 6 opened on schedule. Crate 7 had a microfracture in the lower seal plate, and when I pressed my thumb to the release panel on a Tuesday morning, with a cup of cold pressed grain tea on the shelf beside me, it exhaled a breath that was not quite air, more like the long sigh of pressurized nothing, and the lock mechanism disengaged 2 generations early. I noted it in the intake log. Then I opened the crate and began cataloging. The Vethrani had been obsessive record keepers, which was part of why their successor species had maintained the archive obligation at all. Their records were not merely event logs. They were annotated, cross-referenced, and in the final years of the hegemony, increasingly self-critical. The files from the last 40 years of Vethrani governance were thick with internal commentary, minority dissents, and the kind of careful institutional doubt that only surfaces when a body already suspects it. It has made a catastrophic error and is slowly beginning to understand that the error cannot be recalled. The file I opened first was labeled in Vethrani administrative shorthand that translated roughly as Final Internal Circular Distribution, Senior Council and above, subject reconsideration of Vote 7741. Vote 7741. I had to pull the reference index to find it. When I did, I sat back in my cataloging chair and the grain tea went cold entirely. And I did not move for a long time. Vote 7741 was the Vethrani Hegemony Council's decision, passed by near unanimous margin 163 years before the civilization ceased to exist, to formally exile the human species from all hegemony-affiliated interstellar commerce, treaty framework, and legal standing. The circular I was holding was written 40 years after that vote. I read it. Then I started reading the others. I should be specific about what the Sovereignty Commission was doing that Tuesday, because the distance between the basement archive floor and the commission chamber above was not only architectural. The commission occupied the upper tiers of the Accord Citadel, a structure whose exterior was genuine polished stone from 4 different settled worlds, a deliberate architectural statement about the weight of accumulated civilization. My workspace was 2 levels below the loading dock. The building's gravity of purpose ran downhill in a literal sense. The closer you were to the sovereignty floor, the more the institution believed you mattered. The commission had 43 voting members, drawn from the 7 major species confederations currently recognized under the Interstellar Continuity Accords. The chair was First Arbiter Dovithan Sass, a Culthree statesperson of approximately 90 years who had been on the commission for 3 decades and who had, in that time, developed a quality of institutional certainty that I had observed in only the most senior officials. The total comfort of a mind that has confused familiarity with understanding. I am being precise, not unkind. I had catalogued the careers of people like Arbiter Sass across 6 species and 2 centuries of records. The failure mode was consistent. The item before the commission that Tuesday was Resolution 1194. The formal, permanent exile of the human species from the Interstellar Continuity Accords framework. Not a sanction, not a trade restriction. Full exile, the removal of every legal standing, every treaty protection, every recognized right of presence in designated interstellar corridors. The language was technical, as it always was. The effect was not once passed, any human vessel in Accord's designated space could be boarded, seized, or destroyed without triggering the intervention clause. Human colonies under Accord's adjacent protection would lose that protection. The sovereign quarantine zone, established around 17 systems within reasonable transit of the human home system, would expand to include those systems. Human beings as a legal category would cease to exist under the framework that governed 82% of known settled space. It was the most significant vote the Commission had taken in 40 years. The stated grounds were accumulated: a series of human diplomatic disruptions over the past decade, refusal to submit to the Commission's jurisdictional reach confirmation process, the deployment of human military vessels in 3 contested corridors without Accord's notification, and the matter of the Dovenhall Station incident, in which a human trade representative had physically removed and retained a binding treaty document during a session, an act the Commission had categorized as institutional assault. I had read the Dovenhall transcript. The human trade representative had removed the document because 2 Commission members were in the process of falsifying its terms before the countersignature. The Commission's categorization of this act as assault was a framing decision of considerable audacity. But I was an archivist. It was not my place to say so in the Commission chamber. What I had in my hands, however, was something different. By mid-morning I had pulled every Dead Empire archive we held, and begun working through the cross-referenced final circulars and restricted internal correspondence. This was not standard procedure. Standard procedure was sequential, cataloging by crate number and intake date. What I was doing was technically within my authority. Archivists held standing access to all unsealed records, and Crate 7 had unsealed itself, but it was not what I was paid to do on a Tuesday. I did it anyway. We held terminal records for 6 extinct or collapsed interstellar civilizations: the Vethrani Hegemony, the Peluvian Concord, the Oscar Dominion, the Reuven Ecclesiastical Council, the Davrith Star League, and the Marin Trade Compact. 6 bodies, 6 archives, 6 different species, 6 different governance structures, 6 different reasons the civilizations had ultimately collapsed or been absorbed. Each of them had voted on the human question at some point in their history. I am going to tell you what I found, but I want to be precise about the emotional character of the discovery, because it was not what you might expect. There was no mounting dread, no cold sweat, no dramatic turning of pages. The experience was closer to standing in a field during a clear day and watching the same cloud formation move in from 6 different directions simultaneously. Not threatening, exactly. More like a phenomenon that your pattern recognition refuses to dismiss. The cloud formation is not nothing, it keeps returning. The sensible response is not panic, it is attention. The Vethrani circular was the most detailed, so I will give it first. The Vethrani hegemony had exiled humanity in year 423 of their standard calendar, 40 years before what they called the era of accelerating difficulty, which was the administrative euphemism for the period in which their civilization began its terminal decline. The exile had been procedurally straightforward, a council vote, near unanimous, following a multi-year campaign by a senior policy faction that argued humans were an unquantifiable instability factor in the hegemony's commercial and political calculus. The humans, at the time of the vote, had been present at exactly 2 hegemony council sessions, had signed 1 minor navigational treaty, and had, in the estimation of the faction's lead document, demonstrated a consistent pattern of refusing to accept the defined terms of their position, which was, I noted, a remarkable way to describe a species that had simply kept asking for equal treaty standing instead of the associate observer status the hegemony offered. The internal circular 40 years later, the one I was holding when the grain tia went cold, had been written by a Vethrani senior counsel named Orvith Dalun, who had spent 30 years in the foreign relations apparatus, and who wrote the way people write when they are no longer trying to protect their career. It was addressed to the hegemony's final sitting council chair and 4 senior advisors. It was never formally acknowledged. Its distribution stamp showed it had been read by all 5 addressees. The relevant section, the one I have replayed in my memory more times than I can count in the years since, read as follows. We voted them out of the framework in order to control the variables. We understood them well enough, we thought, to predict their trajectory absent the framework's restraints. We were wrong about the prediction, and we were wrong about the understanding. In the 40 years since Vote 7741, the human territorial presence has expanded by a factor of 11. Their fleet capacity, as best our intelligence apparatus can now assess, exceeds any single hegemony fleet zone. They have established 11 separate bilateral treaties with species we once counted as exclusively aligned with hegemony interests. None of this was visible from the council chamber. None of it was accounted for in the projections. We removed them from the board, and they built a different board. That last sentence, I read it 4 times. Then I went to the Peluvian Concord files. The Peluvian Concord had been a maritime civilization that expanded into space through a series of colonial federation models, and their governance structure reflected this. A ring of regional councils feeding into a central arbitration body, slow to move and deeply resistant to any action that could be characterized as unilateral. They had not exiled humanity so much as simply refused to recognize the human species as a qualifying entity under their framework, a distinction that was procedural rather than formal but had the same practical effect. Humans had been present at 2 Peluvian Concord arbitration sessions in the early expansion period, had been denied qualifying status both times, and had subsequently ceased attending. The Peluvian records were less eloquent than the Vethrani. Their administrative language was dense with cross-references and conditional clauses, and the internal correspondence from the final decades of the Concord was largely concerned with the question of resource allocation in an era of contracting margins. But there was a file, a working group report commissioned by the Concord's final arbitration chair, dated approximately 80 years after the denial of human qualifying status, that was relevant. The report was tasked with assessing why several Concord-affiliated trade corridors had experienced a significant decline in traffic over the previous 2 decades. The working group's finding was that the corridors had been effectively replaced by an alternative routing network that they had not previously cataloged, operated under a series of agreements they did not recognize, and protected by a fleet presence they could not explain given the known specifications of human military capacity at the time of the last Concord intelligence assessment. That assessment, the report noted, was 80 years old. The report's recommendation was to commission a new intelligence assessment. There was no record of one being commissioned. The Concord had collapsed into factional dissolution 15 years later. I noted the date. I also noted something in the margin of the working group report's cover page, a brief annotation by whoever had filed the document in the Concord's Central Archive. It said, in the Peluvian commercial shorthand filed for record, no action taken. 4 words in the margin of a document that had tried, in the dense and careful language of bureaucratic concern, to say that something was wrong. No action taken. Filed and left for someone like me to read a century and a half afterward. I moved to the Oscar files. The Oscar Dominion was the most straightforward. They had declared humanity a non-entity under their legal framework after a border incident in which a human surveying vessel had entered a system that the Dominion claimed as sovereign territory and had refused to depart when ordered. The human vessel had remained in the system for 11 days, completing its survey, then departed without engaging, without communicating further, and without incident. The Oscar Dominion had classified this as an act of defiance and had issued a formal declaration removing all human legal standing in Dominion space. The follow-on records were, in their way, the most telling. Over the subsequent century, the Dominion had issued 17 additional declarations, each one escalating the formal language of the human exclusion. By the time the Oscar Dominion had fragmented into the 3 competing successor states that now held associate observer status in the current Accords framework, they were issuing declarations about human non-entity status on a semi-annual basis, each one slightly more emphatic than the last, each one, as far as the archival record showed, read by no one outside the issuing body. The humans had not responded to any of them. I sat with that for a while. 17 declarations of increasing force, issued to an audience that had stopped paying attention. There is something instructive in the compulsive quality of that. A body that knows, at some level, that its declarations are not producing the effect they are meant to produce, and responds to that knowledge not by examining the premise of the declarations, but by issuing more of them, louder. The declarations were not about the humans anymore, I think. They were about maintaining, for the benefit of the Dominion's own internal audience, the appearance that the humans were contained, that the declaration had force, that the category held. There was a final internal memo from the Dominion's last sitting arbitration council, written in the days before the formal dissolution vote. Most of it was administrative, the disposition of assets, the assignment of treaty obligations to successor states. Near the end, there was a paragraph that had been written by hand in the margin, in a script that the translation apparatus identified as belonging to one of the council's senior members. It said, "We have been issuing declarations to an audience that stopped listening long ago. I do not know when they stopped. That is the problem." I photographed the margin note and added it to my working file. The Reuven Ecclesiastical Council had formally excommunicated the human species, their term, following a theological dispute about the status of non-aligned sentient life under the Reuven cosmological framework. The dispute had been triggered by a human academic who had attended a Reuven symposium as an observer and had asked, during a question period, whether the cosmological framework's exclusion of non-Reuven sentient life was a theological position or a political one. The question had caused a procedural crisis that lasted 3 sessions, and the eventual resolution had been the excommunication declaration, which carried all the formal weight of Reuven ecclesiastical law and the practical force, in interstellar terms, of a strongly worded letter. The Reuven Council no longer existed as a sovereign body. It had been absorbed voluntarily into the Davrith Star League approximately 140 years later, after a period of sustained internal decline that their own records attributed, in the main, to the progressive loss of commercially significant relationships with species who had chosen to develop alternative frameworks for navigating contested theological and governance questions. The human academic I found in a footnote had published the question and the procedural crisis as part of a broader work on interstellar institutional resistance to external scrutiny. It had been translated into 4 non-human languages within a decade of publication. I noted this without comment in my working file. I thought about it, though. A species that responds to formal excommunication not with outrage, not with a counter-declaration, but with a published academic paper. There is a particular quality of confidence in that, the confidence of someone who does not need the institution's recognition to conduct their work, and who finds the institution's response more interesting as a data point than as a threat. The Davrith Star League was the one that required me to sit still for a while. The Davarath were a militarist civilization, not aggressive in the expansionist sense, but organized around the premise that security was the primary value, and that all other political goods were contingent on its maintenance. Their Star League had been one of the most capable military bodies in the settled galaxy during its peak period, and their governance structure reflected this. A council of military sector leaders, a civilian advisory body with limited formal authority, and a supremacy clause that gave the military council final authority in any matter determined to touch on security questions. The Davarath had not simply exiled humanity. They had done something considerably more considered. They had assessed humanity, determined that humanity represented a Category 3 security ambiguity, and placed the species under a formal quarantine protocol, a legal and military structure that restricted human movement, communication, and treaty formation in Davarath-adjacent space, and that required the Davarath fleet to maintain a constant observation posture along the quarantine boundary. The protocol had been in effect for approximately 60 years when the Davarath Military Council commissioned a comprehensive security review. I had the full text of that review. It was 140 pages, and the section relevant to the human question began on page 87. I will summarize, because the full section ran to 12 pages of dense military analytical prose. The review found that the quarantine protocol had consumed, over 60 years, approximately 14% of the Davarath fleet's operational capacity. Ships assigned to boundary observation, resupply runs to observation stations, administrative staff processing the constant stream of data from the quarantine perimeter. It had also, the review found, required the Davarath to decline 12 bilateral security agreements with other species during the period in question, because the terms of those agreements had included provisions that would have required sharing quarantine zone intelligence with partner species, which the protocol forbade. In exchange for this expenditure, the protocol had, and I am quoting directly from page 93, successfully restricted human movement in sectors representing approximately 8.3% of their actual operational theater, while human activity in the remaining 91.7% has proceeded without impediment or observation. The review recommended maintaining the protocol. I noted that recommendation and went on, but I came back to it because there was something in that recommendation that sat in the room with me. Not the percentage, though the percentage was stark enough. It was the recommendation itself. A military council that just looked at its containment mechanism covers 8.3% of the thing it is meant to contain and recommends maintaining it. The explanation has to be that the mechanism was never truly about the humans. It was about the council's ability to tell itself a certain story about the humans, a story in which they were contained, bounded, manageable. Reducing the mechanism would have meant reducing the story. There was a handwritten annotation on the review's executive summary page, not a brief margin note like the ones in the Oscar files, but a formal annotation from the military council's sitting chair, who had been the most senior Davarath official to review the document. The annotation was 4 words in the original language, which the translation apparatus rendered as, "We are the boundary." I am still not entirely certain what the council chair meant, but I think she was describing, in the compact language of someone who has just understood a long-standing error, what the quarantine protocol had actually accomplished. It had defined the limits of Davarath attention. The humans had simply worked in the space beyond those limits. The boundary was not theirs. It was the Davarath's own. They had drawn the line. And the line had been a cage, but not for the humans. The Marin Trade Compact was the last, and in some ways the simplest. The Marin were a mercantile civilization whose governance was organized entirely around commercial relationships. Their compact was not a political body in the conventional sense. It had no military, no territorial sovereignty, and no legal enforcement capacity. What it had was a recognition framework, a set of formal commercial agreements that once entered, gave member species access to Marin trade routes, pricing standards, arbitration services, and the accumulated commercial intelligence of a civilization that had been trading across the settled galaxy for approximately 800 years. To be recognized by the Marin Compact was, during the Compact's peak period, to be commercially credible across a significant fraction of known space. To be denied recognition was, in practical terms, to be invisible to a substantial portion of the interstellar commercial economy. The Marin had denied humanity recognition 3 times. Each denial had been issued following a formal assessment process, and each assessment had concluded, in essentially identical language, that humanity did not meet the Compact's minimum standards for commercial framework integration. The stated grounds varied across the 3 assessments. The first cited insufficient territorial coherence, the second cited insufficient treaty network depth, the third cited insufficient demonstrated compliance with existing Compact arbitration norms. But the operational conclusion was the same each time, not yet, and by implication, not in a way that the Compact anticipated changing. The Marin Compact had dissolved approximately 180 years after the 3rd denial. The dissolution had not been catastrophic. There was no collapse, no military defeat, no theological crisis. The Compact had simply become progressively less relevant as the commercial landscape shifted around it, as new trade corridors developed outside its recognition framework, as the species it had once credentialed found alternative paths to commercial credibility. The dissolution vote had passed with a comfortable majority, which was, in its way, the most dispiriting possible ending for a commercial civilization. Not defeated, but simply surpassed and left behind. The final Compact records included a routine commercial intelligence summary, issued in the year of the dissolution, that noted, in the dry, statistical language of commercial analysts who are simply reporting data rather than drawing conclusions, that the largest single non-Compact commercial network currently operating in the settled galaxy was the human trade framework, which had grown, over the preceding century, from a regional network of approximately 40 bilateral agreements to a web of 314 agreements covering species on inhabited arm of the galactic spiral. No formal comment was appended to this note in the Compact's records, no annotation, no marginal observation, no internal circular. It had been filed, read and left to sit in the archive. I logged it, the way I logged everything. Then I sat for a moment in the basement of the Accord's Citadel and looked at the 6 Dead Empire files spread across my cataloging table. And I understood what I was looking at, not a coincidence, not 6 isolated decisions. A pattern that was not difficult to read once you had the full set. 6 civilizations, 6 formal acts of exclusion, 6 sets of terminal records that contained, each in their own language and register, the same essential admission. We acted on an understanding of humanity that was accurate at one moment, and became, without our noticing, a map of a place that no longer existed. We drew the line and watched the line, and the humans built a different board. The midday vote was in 3 hours. I took the stairs. There is an elevator in the Accord Citadel, reserved for commission members and their delegations, and there are service corridors used by administrative staff. I was neither a commission member nor, strictly speaking, in service corridor territory, with 6 archive crates on a transport dolly. But the rules governing archivist access to the commission floor were less clear than you might expect, primarily because no archivist had ever found it necessary to go there with urgency before. The security officer on the commission floor landing was a Cull-3 named Vester, who I had passed twice in the corridor over my 6 months in the basement and who had never spoken to me. He looked at the dolly, at the crates, at me, and asked, with the practiced economy of someone who is not paid to be surprised, what I thought I was doing. I told him I had materials for the Commission's consideration under Section 14 of the Accord's Archive Accessibility Clause, which allows any accredited archivist to submit materials deemed relevant to an active commission proceeding. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he asked if the chair had been informed. I said that I was informing the chair now. There is a quality of authority that exists entirely in the confidence of the statement, independent of any formal standing behind it. I have observed it in commission members, in military attaché, in the rare human diplomat who had appeared before the commission in the years of my tenure. I did not possess it naturally, but I had spent years reading the records of people who did, and I had absorbed something of the grammar of it. Vesther let me through. The commission chamber was not what you imagine if you have not been inside it. There is no dome. There are no tiered galleries descending into theatrical darkness, no floating platforms, no theatrical lighting designed to make the proceedings feel like judgment from above. The chamber was functional, a long oval room with a continuous table, 43 chairs, holographic display panels mounted at intervals, and the Accords seal inlaid in the floor at the center. High windows along the upper wall let in the flat institutional daylight of a mid-morning in early autumn. It smelled of whatever the cleaning staff used on the stone flooring, which was not unpleasant. 41 of the 43 commission members were present. 2 delegations had sent substitutes, which was common. First Arbiter Dovithan Sass sat at the head of the table, her cool-3 composure undisturbed by my entry. She had the quality, which I had observed in the files, of never allowing a disruption to register on her face until she had decided how to register it. The other 40 commission members reacted with varying degrees of surprise, irritation, and confusion as a baseline-level archivist, with a transport dolly full of archive crates, cleared his throat and stopped at the center of the oval. Arbiter Sass waited for approximately 4 seconds, then said, in the measured cadence she used for procedural matters, "This chamber is in session. State your standing and your purpose." Halvard Osen, Archivist 3rd Tier, Commission for the Preservation of Interstellar Historical Record. I placed my hands on the handle of the dolly. Section 14 says submission. I have materials relevant to the matter under consideration. There was a pause. The Commission's senior procedural clerk, a Varathi named Corvus, who I had interacted with twice, and who had a precise understanding of the Accord's archive provisions, looked at the Arbiter. The Arbiter looked at me. Then she said, "Proceed, Archivist." I brought the first crate to the table and set it down. Vithrani Hegemony Terminal Records, I said. Archive intake 6 months prior. Unsealed this morning under standard preservation protocol. I set the second crate beside the first. Peluvian Concord Terminal Records. Oscar Dominion Terminal Records. 3rd and 4th crates. Reuven Ecclesiastical Council. Davrath Star League. Marin Trade Compact. 5th, 6th. 6 crates on the commission table. The Accord's seal was partially visible between them. Arbiter Sass watched this with a patience that I recognized as the kind that is waiting for a point to arrive so it can be addressed and dismissed. Archivist Osen. The Commission is aware of its archive obligations. Please specify the relevance to the current proceeding. I opened Crate 7 and removed the Vithrani final circular. I placed it in front of the Arbiter and opened it to the relevant section. Each of these 6 civilizations formally removed humanity from their legal and treaty frameworks, I said. The removal was accomplished through a range of mechanisms: formal exile, denial of recognition, quarantine protocol, excommunication, non-entity declaration. The specific procedure varied. The outcome was consistent. I paused. Each of these 6 civilizations no longer exists. The chamber was quiet, not dramatically quiet. Not the kind of silence that signals imminent revelation, but the quiet of an institutional body that has encountered a procedural irregularity it has not yet categorized. Several members had turned to face each other. The delegate from the Peluvian Successor Confederacy was looking at the crates the way you look at an object when you are trying to determine that whether its presence in the room changes what kind of room you are in. The military bloc representative, a tall Davarath, a successor state official, whose institutional lineage ran directly through the Star League, had gone very still. I noted all of this in the compressed way. You note things when you know you are going to need to remember them, and that you may not have long. Arbiter Sass said, "The Commission is aware that several of these civilizations have records on the human question. Their collapse or dissolution has multiple documented causes." "Yes," I said. "I am not claiming causation." The Arbiter's head tilted fractionally. "Then what are you claiming?" I thought about Orvith Dalun, writing his circular 40 years after the vote that no one had revisited. I thought about the Davarath Council Chair's forward annotation and what it had taken to earn it. I thought about the Marin analysts filing their final commercial intelligence summary in the year of the dissolution. noting the size of the human trade network without comment, without conclusion, filing it, and leaving it for someone else to read later. I am not making a claim, I said. I'm making a submission. 6 civilizations, 6 decisions, 6 sets of terminal records. The records are in the crates. The commission can review them. I stepped back from the table. I'm noting, for the procedural record, that each of these bodies produced internal documentation, in some cases decades after the relevant vote, that concluded, in varying degrees of clarity, that they had miscalculated the human question. Specifically, that the act of removing humanity from the framework had not produced the conditions they anticipated, and that their subsequent assessment of human capacity had remained anchored to the state of human development at the time of the removal, rather than to the state of human development at the time of the assessment. I let that land. The military bloc representative had leaned forward. Almost imperceptibly, 2 members near the end of the table were conferring in quiet voices. The procedural clerk, Corvus, was writing. In each case, I continued, the body that issued the removal acted on what it believed was an accurate and current understanding of the human species. The terminal records indicate that by the time the error was identified internally, the error was no longer correctable. I looked at the arbiter steadily. I am noting this. The commission may proceed as it determines appropriate. I have no authority to advise the vote. I am an archivist. Then, because it was the one thing I could do that had any weight beyond the procedural, I added, Crate 7 unsealed itself this morning. The relevant circular is on top, marked with a blue tab. I would recommend the arbiter read the section beginning on page 4 before the vote proceeds. Arbiter Sassas looked at the circular. She looked at me. There was something behind her institutional calm that was harder to read than irritation or dismissal. Something that a person looks like when a category of thing they have encountered before has arrived in a form they did not expect. We will take a recess, she said. The recess lasted an hour and 40 minutes. I know because I sat in the waiting corridor outside the commission floor with the empty transport, dolly, the crate still on the commission table, and the awareness that I had done the only thing I was positioned to do, and that the doing of it did not guarantee the outcome. I am not going to pretend I was calm. I was not calm in the sense of being unaffected. I was calm in the sense of having already arrived at the place, past which there was nothing further to arrive at. I had found the pattern. I had brought it to the people who needed to see it. Whether they would see it, or whether they would see it and choose to proceed anyway, was not within my authority to determine. Through the waiting corridor's single window, I could see a fraction of the Citadel's exterior courtyard, and beyond that, the upper edge of the city's commercial district, and above that, the sky, flat gray with high cloud cover, the kind of overcast that does not threaten rain so much as describe an absence of direct light. Nothing was visible through the cloud cover. The sky was simply gray. Corvus, the procedural clerk, came out once to ask if I needed anything. I said I did not. She looked at me, with an expression I have seen on the faces of careful institutional servants who have witnessed something they suspect they will be discussing for years. She went back inside. At some point during the recess, I heard voices through the chamber wall, not words but registers, the sustained murmur of a body working through something, a single voice rising above the others, not in anger but in emphasis, and then being answered by 2 or 3 others simultaneously. A period of silence that lasted long enough to be intentional. More murmuring, then the flat procedural silence of a body preparing to reconvene. I thought about the Vethrani, and about Orvith Dalun, and about what it must have felt like to write a circular that was read and acknowledged and ultimately filed and forgotten, all in the same decade. I thought about the Oscar Dominion issuing 17 escalating declarations of human non-entity status to an audience that had stopped listening, and about the military council chair's 4-word margin note, and about the Marin analysts writing their final summary with the practiced neutrality of people who have long since understood that the data is what it is, and that the data will say what it says, regardless of what anyone does with it. I thought about the 6 civilizations that were gone. Then the doors opened and Corvus called me back inside. The commission had used the recess productively, in the sense that when I returned to the chamber, there was a quality of stillness among the 42 members that was different from the stillness of interrupted procedure. Some of the archives had been opened. The Vethrani circular was visible in front of at least 3 delegates, in addition to the arbiter. The Devarath Review lay open near the far end of the table. Several holographic panels had been active. I could see the residual glow on the display. Surfaces data pulled and reviewed during the break, figures that some member had wanted to cross-check against what the archives were saying. The military bloc representative The Davareth successor state official had the Davareth Reviews page 93 face up in front of him. He was not reading it. He was looking at it the way you look at a document when you have already absorbed it and are now deciding what it means for what you were about to do. Arbiter Sauce was standing, which was unusual. She stood at the head of the table, with a Vethrani circular in front of her and her hands flat on the table surface. And she looked at me when I came in with an expression that was, for the first time, not entirely composure. "Archivist Osen," she said, "the Commission has reviewed the materials you have submitted." "Yes, Arbiter." "The Commission wishes to note, for the record, that the collapse of the 6 civilizations represented in these archives has multiple documented causes, and that a causal relationship between their actions on the human question and their eventual dissolution cannot be established from these records." "I said that myself," I said. "I am not claiming causation. You are, however, claiming a pattern. I am submitting evidence of a pattern. The pattern is there to be read or not read, as the Commission determines." There was a pause. The institutional weight of 42 species representatives in a room considering a procedural irregularity that had introduced historical evidence they had not anticipated is a different kind of weight from the theoretical weight of civilizational decision-making. It is immediate. It is in the air of the room, in the adjusted postures, in the angles at which people are looking at each other versus not looking at each other. The Commission, Arbiter Sauce said, has questions about the human status under the current Accords framework as it exists today. Not the historical record, the present status. "I can speak to what the archive record shows," I said. "I am not an intelligence officer. I can't speak to current operational data." "You are an archivist," she said it carefully. The way someone says a title, when they are thinking about what the title means, and finding it more than they expected. "What does the archive record show about the current status of the human species?" I had thought about how to answer this during the recess. "The most recent entry in our active record for the human species dates from 11 years ago," I said. "It is a summary of Human Trace Network expansion filed by the Commission's own Commercial Assessment Office. It describes a network of approximately 208 bilateral agreements." I paused. "The Marin Compact's final commercial intelligence summary, filed in the year of their dissolution, described the human trade network as encompassing 314 agreements. That document is 112 years old." The room processed this. Several delegates were doing the arithmetic. The delegate from the Veth Successor Confederacy, the largest of the species, that had inherited Vethrani governance obligations, spoke for the first time. Her name was Pelara Doveth, and she had the particular stillness of someone who is not speaking because they have nothing to say, but because they are deciding whether what they have to say serves any purpose. "You are suggesting," she said, "that our current assessment of human capacity may be similarly outdated." "I am submitting 6 archives that contain 6 separate instances of a body that acted on an outdated assessment," I said. "Each body believed its assessment was current. Each body was wrong about that belief. I am not in a position to determine whether the Commission's current assessment is accurate. I have no access to current intelligence." I looked at her steadily. "I am an archivist. I can only tell you what has happened before." Pelara Doveth sat back in her chair with the slow deliberateness of someone absorbing weight. The delegate from the Reuven Successor Assembly, a younger official who had not spoken during the initial session, raised one of her secondary limbs, the Reuven gesture for a procedural point. "The Reuven excommunication record," she said. I had not previously reviewed it. She looked at the open crate. "The human who raised the question at the symposium, the academic. Is there a current record?" "The academic's published work is in the Reuven archive," I said. "I cannot speak to their current status. The Reuven record ends with the Council's absorption into the Star League." The delegate looked at the crate for another moment. Then she said, quietly, to no one in particular, "We were their successors, and we never read the file." No one answered that. Arbiter Sauce said, "The Commission will vote." I was asked to wait outside again. This time the recess lasted 11 minutes. I counted them. The corridor outside the Commission floor had a clock display mounted near the elevator, a standard institutional timepiece, the kind that marks hours and fractions without comment. I watched it. 11 minutes, and by my count, somewhere between 20 and 30 seconds. 11 minutes to vote on the formal exile of a species from 82% of known settled space. I had worked in this building for 3 years. I understood that the Commission was an efficient body, and that the Arbiter ran her sessions with the procedural economy of someone who believed that time spent deliberating past the point of decision was time wasted. I also understood that the speed of the vote told me something about the distribution of conviction in that room. Some of those 26 votes had been decided before my submission. Some had been decided during the recess. Some, perhaps, had been decided in the corridor between the chamber and wherever the delegates went when the doors closed. 9 had shifted by my estimate. 9 of 43, 1 and 5, not enough, and more than I had reason to expect from a body that had spent 3 years building toward this resolution. I thought about that as I walked back to the basement. The vote passed. I want to be direct about this, because I think any account that softens it into something that did not happen would be a different kind of lie from the Oscar Dominion's 17 declarations, but a lie in the same family. Resolution 1194 passed by a vote of 26 to 17, with no abstentions. The formal exile of humanity from the Interstellar Continuity Accords framework was registered, sealed, and transmitted to all member bodies in the standard distribution. The 6 archive crates were returned to me for cataloging and restorage. Arbiter Sauce read the resolution into the formal record with a neutral procedural cadence she used for every formal act, and the chamber proceeded to the next item on the session agenda. The 17 dissenting votes were not nothing. Before the submission, I had been told, by Corvus, over the brief conversation we had in the corridor, that the projection was 31 in favor, 12 against. The archives had moved 9 votes. Whether that was a testament to the persuasive weight of historical evidence or to the procedural's disruption of an archivist appearing with a transport dolly at an inopportune moment, I could not say. 9 votes, not enough, but not nothing. I took the crates back to the basement and cataloged them. Then I sat at my desk with the intake log and wrote the entry for the day's events. Crate 7, Vethrani Hegemony, Terminal Records, unsealed under Standard Protocol, cataloged, submitted under Section 14C to Commission Proceeding, returned post-proceeding, standard notation, nothing unusual in the language. Then I opened a new file and began writing what I am writing now. Because I understood something in the moment the vote was announced that I had not fully understood before. The pattern was not a warning in the sense I had initially read it. Not a warning that the vote would fail. It was a warning about what came after the vote. In the 11 years since Resolution 1194 passed, I have continued my work in the archive basement. I have been promoted once to Archivist Second Tier, which carries a slightly larger workstation and access to a different category of restricted file. I have continued to catalog the terminal records of dead civilizations, which is, when you do it long enough, a practice that changes the way you read the present, not with despair and not with the particular arrogance of someone who believes they have identified an inescapable cycle, simply with attention. The way the Marin analysts wrote their final commercial summary, with the neutrality of people who understand that the data is what it is. What the data is, in the 11 years since the vote, is this. The Commission's Commercial Assessment Office filed its first revised estimate of human trade network activity 8 months after Resolution 1194. It found that the network, which had been assessed at 208 agreements in the 11-year-old prior estimate, had, in the 11 years since that estimate was compiled, expanded to 361 agreements. The new assessment included a notation that 37 of those agreements were with species that had previously been exclusively aligned with Accords member interests. The Commission noted the assessment and filed it. 14 months after Resolution 1194, the first formal dispute arose between an Accords member and a human-affiliated vessel over the right of transit in a corridor that the exile resolution had placed within the sovereign quarantine zone. The human vessel had transited the corridor without notification, which was now illegal under the exile resolution. The Accords member had attempted to intercept the vessel. The intercept had not succeeded, not because of conflict, but because, by the time the intercept order was communicated through standard chain of command channels, the vessel was no longer in the corridor. The Commission's legal office filed a formal violation notice. There is no record of it having been received or acknowledged. I noted this. I also noted that the language of the legal office's violation notice bore a structural resemblance to the Oscar Dominion's third formal declaration of human non-entity status, not the same words, the same shape, the confident formal assertion of a consequence that the asserting party did not have the operational capacity to enforce. In the second year, the Commission's border monitoring apparatus reported an unusual pattern in sovereign quarantine zone sensor data, intermittent contacts at the outer perimeter that could not be resolved into ship identifications using the Commission's standard transponder protocols. The contacts were not hostile, they were not communicating, They were present, and then not present, and then present again in a different section of the perimeter. The monitoring report classified them as sensor anomalies pending further investigation. I read the monitoring report because a copy was routed to the archive office as part of the standard distribution for all commission intelligence outputs. I read it and I thought about the Davarath Star League's quarantine protocol, and about the 14% of fleet capacity consumed by 60 years of boundary observation, and about page 93's finding that the observation had covered 8.3% of human operational activity. I did not write anything in the margin of the monitoring report. I filed it and noted the date. In the third year after Resolution 1194, the Commission's intelligence summary, the first one I had access to, through a reclassification that extended archivist second-tier access to certain diplomatic intelligence categories, noted that human presence in Accord's adjacent space had increased by approximately 40% since the passage of the exile resolution. The summary offered two possible explanations: that human operational tempo in the region had genuinely increased, or that prior assessments had undercounted human activity. It could not distinguish between the two possibilities with available data. I noted that the Vithrani's final internal circular had said something similar in more personal terms about their own intelligence capability after Vote 7741. A footnote in the third-year summary, which would have been easy to miss, observed that the Commission's standard methodology for human activity assessment had last been updated prior to the bilateral agreement expansion that began in the period before Resolution 1194, and that there was a question, flagged by the analyst team, about whether the methodology remained fit for purpose. The footnote recommended a methodology review. No methodology review was commissioned that year, or in the year following that, as far as the records I had access to showed. In the fifth year, 2 Accords member species filed requests for bilateral agreements with the human species, not under the Accords framework, but outside it, under the category of direct species-to-species commercial agreements that the Accords framework technically permitted, but had never been designed to accommodate at scale. The Commission's legal office ruled that such agreements, while technically permissible, would constitute a de facto recognition of human commercial standing that was inconsistent with the spirit of Resolution 1194. Both species proceeded with the agreements. I noted in my personal file that this was a closer parallel to the Davarath Star League's quarantine protocol review than anything else in the record. Not the same, but the same family of problem. The mechanism designed to contain a thing has to be continually extended because the thing is not contained. It is simply operating somewhere the mechanism does not reach. The Commission issued a formal clarification of its guidelines on non-framework bilateral agreements. It was circulated to all member bodies. 2 additional species filed bilateral requests within the month. In the 6th year, a human diplomatic contact, the first formal human communication to any Accords-affiliated body since Resolution 1194, arrived at the Commission through a routing channel that did not technically exist under the exile framework, though, because the exile framework had removed the routing channels and the humans were using one that predated the framework entirely, a legacy communication pathway established under a treaty so old that its terms were stored in my section of the archive rather than in the active diplomatic record. The communication was brief. It acknowledged the passage of Resolution 1194. It noted that the human species continued to operate in accordance with its own treaties and frameworks. It expressed no objection, no grievance, no demand. The Commission's legal office reviewed the communication for 3 weeks and then classified it as a non-actionable contact on the grounds that the exile resolution had removed the legal standing of any human communication to be formally received. The communication was filed. I have a copy. When I read it, I thought of the Marin commercial analysts and their final summary, the practiced neutrality of someone who understands that the record will speak for itself. In the 7th year, the Commission established a special subcommittee on human adjacent activity. The subcommittee met quarterly. I was not in its meetings and have no record of its proceedings, but its output, the summary reports it filed in the Commission's central record, tells enough. The reports grew in length over the 7 quarterly sessions that had been filed by the time I was writing this passage, and the pattern of their growth was not the growth of a body accumulating confidence. It was the growth of a body accumulating questions. Each report was longer than the previous one, and the additional length was not additional resolution. It was additional uncertainty, carefully documented. I had seen this before, in the Peluvian Working Group report on the declining trade corridors. In the Davarath Security Review, the body reaches a point where its own data is telling it something it does not want to hear, and the response is to generate more data, to commission more reviews, to produce documentation that demonstrates the body is taking the situation seriously, without taking any action that would require admitting what the situation actually is. In the 9th year after the vote, the Commercial Assessment Office filed a revised estimate that placed the Human Bilateral Agreement Network at 409 agreements, and added a notation that I logged without comment and have thought about nearly every day since. The assessment could no longer determine the geographic extent of human commercial activity, because the network had expanded into regions that the Commission's standards assessment methodology did not cover. Not that the humans were operating in covered regions without authorization, that the regions were not covered. I thought about Orvith Dallon's sentence, "We removed them from the board, and they built a different board." In the 10th year, Pelara Dovith, the delegate from the Veth Successor Confederacy, the one who had sat back in her chair during the commission session 11 years before, was elevated to deputy arbiter of the commission. She had, I understood from the administrative records I had access to, consistently voted in the minority on matters touching the human framework since Resolution 1194. I do not know whether her elevation changed anything about the commission's internal deliberations. I am not in those rooms. What I do know is that she sent a routing notice to the archive access log 8 months into her tenure as deputy arbiter, requesting copies of the summary materials from the original Section 14Z submission, the Vithrani Circular, the Peluvian Working Group Report, the Davarath Security Review, the Marin Final Commercial Summary. I processed the request myself. I sent the materials. I noted it in the log. 7 weeks later, a second request came through. This one from the Commission's Intelligence Assessment Directorate, not from Pelara Dovith's office, requesting the full Davarath Star League Security Review in its entirety, including the classified annexes that I held under second-tier access. The request was routed through proper channels and properly authorized. I sent it. The timing of the two requests, Pelara Dovith's review of the summary materials, followed 7 weeks later by the Intelligence Directorate's request for the full Davarath document, was not something I could confirm as connected. It may have been coincidence, but I noted the timing, the way I noted everything, and I added a quiet annotation to my personal file. Something in the upper tiers of the institution was beginning. In the way of institutions, the slow process of arriving at a conclusion that was already written in the archive. No formal response was filed. Nothing further came through the routing system, but the request was there. Someone in the upper tiers of the institution had gone looking for the record. That is not nothing. That is the way institutions change. Not in single votes, not in procedural disruptions by archivists with transport dollies, but in the slow accumulation of individuals who have read something they cannot unread, who carry it with them into the rooms where the decisions are made, and who, when the moment comes, vote differently than they might have otherwise. I do not know if the moment will come in time. I am going to describe what I saw through the archive basement's single exterior window on a Tuesday evening in the 11th year after Resolution 1194. Which was the same Tuesday that the Commission's Subcommittee on Human Adjacent Activity filed its 8th quarterly report, the one that the Commission's Intelligence Office had, I later learned, spent 3 weeks delaying because they were not certain how to categorize what they were describing. The window looks west. In the late afternoon and evening, when the cloud cover permits, it catches the last of the daylight. I had been working late, cross-referencing the Peluvian Concord's commercial corridor files against the current trade route mapping, because there was a question in the subcommittee's latest report about corridor usage that I thought I might be able to contextualize from the Peluvian records. I had not eaten since mid-morning. The grain tea on my shelf had gone cold again. At approximately the 17th hour, the cloud cover broke and I saw the sky. I want to be precise about what I saw, because precision is the thing that distinguishes a fact from a story that contains a fact. What I saw was this, in the western sky, at a distance and altitude that placed them outside the atmosphere but within the visible range of an unaugmented eye on a clear evening. There were shapes. The shapes were ship-sized. There were enough of them that I could not count them in a single glance, and when I tried to count them deliberately, I lost track between 20 and 30, because more were appearing from behind the cloud margin at the south end of the break. They were not moving in formation. They were not moving at all, as far as I could determine. They were simply there, present in the evening sky the way a fact is present, not announced, not performed, simply occupying space and being visible to anyone who looked up. I looked at them for a long time. I thought about the Commission's subcommittee report, delayed 3 weeks by an intelligence office that had been, I suspected, trying to find language for something that did not fit their existing categories. I thought about the second monitoring anomaly report, filed 4 months prior and still awaiting resolution classification, describing contacts along the quarantine zone perimeter that the sensor network could not resolve and could not explain. I thought about the Davarath military's recommendation to maintain the protocol that covered 3% of human activity and about the council chair's 4-word annotation, and I thought that whoever had written those 4 words, "We are the boundary, we are the bray," might have understood, in the moment of writing them, exactly what I was looking at through this window. The ships were not moving. They were not signaling. They were not positioned in any configuration that suggested imminent action. They were doing what the human diplomatic contact in Year 6 had done, and what the human surveying vessel had done in the Oscar border incident a century and a half ago. They were simply present, doing what they intended to do, visible to anyone with a window and a clear evening, indifferent to whether the institution looking out at them had a category for what it was seeing. Then I turned back to my desk and picked up my intake log and wrote the entry. I noted the time, the date, the weather conditions at the time of the break in the cloud cover, the estimated number of vessels, their approximate position in the sky, and the duration of my observation. Standard notation, the factual record of what was observable from the archive basement window on a Tuesday evening in the 11th year after Resolution 1194. I thought about the Davarath Council Chair's 4 words, "We are the boundary." I thought about what the Commission's subcommittee report had been trying to describe with 3 weeks of delay and careful language, and about what the ships in the western sky were making unnecessary to describe carefully. Some facts do not require language to communicate. They require only a clear evening and a window that faces west. The cloud cover closed again 20 minutes later. The sky returned to gray. The ships were no longer visible, which is not the same as saying they were no longer there. I sat at my desk for a while after the window went gray again. I thought about filing an incident report. I thought about the routing system and the chain of command and the correct procedural pathway for an archivist who observes something from a basement window that may be relevant to an active subcommittee inquiry. I thought about the Oscar Dominion's 17 declarations and about the Commission's legal office's unanswered violation notice and about the word that keeps appearing in the terminal records of dead civilizations, not in a single place, not in a single language, but in the accumulated weight of the record. Too late. I did not file an incident report. An incident report would have been accurate and procedurally appropriate and would have been read and noted and filed. And in 40 years, or 100 years, or in whatever unit of time the institution of this world had remaining, before someone opened its crates and read its circulars, and sat back in their chair and understood the pattern, it would have been there in the record. Another document that was read and acknowledged and ultimately set aside. What I did instead was this. Then, beneath the standard notation, I opened a new section of the file, not a standard log entry, but the continuation of what I have been writing here, and I wrote the rest. I wrote it the way Orvith Dallin had written his circular, and the way the Oscar Dominion's final council member had written his margin note, and the way the Marin analysts had written their final commercial summary. With the understanding that you are writing for whoever reads it later, after the institution that should have read it has already finished making the decision that the document was meant to prevent, you write it anyway. Because the record is the record, and the record persists, and somewhere in a basement archive in a building that will someday itself be a crate of terminal records, someone will unseal it and read it and understand what they are looking at. Every dead empire that touched the human question left the same warning in its final records. The warning was not about human aggression, or human expansion, or human duplicity. It was simpler than that, and more difficult. They said, each of them, in whatever language and administrative register they used, that they had acted on an understanding of humanity that was accurate at one moment, and became, without their noticing, a map of a place that no longer existed. They had drawn the boundary of their attention, and the humans had worked in the past the boundary, and by the time the archive was opened, the space past the boundary had become something none of the dead empires had a category for. The warning is in the record. I submitted 6 crates of it to this commission 11 years ago. The commission voted as it voted. That is in the record, too. The ships in the western sky tonight are also in the record. I do not know what they are waiting for. I do not know if they are waiting at all. What I know from the record is that this commission does not know either, and that the specific quality of not knowing, the comfortable uncertainty of a body that has decided the thing it does not understand is less important than it actually is precisely the condition that each of these 6 dead empires described in their own words, in their own final circulars, in the records that came to me in sealed crates and that I have catalogued and filed and now set down here. The commission voted to exile a species it had never accurately assessed, using an authority it was not large enough to enforce, against an entity that had long since stopped needing its recognition. The same action, in the same shape, that 6 earlier civilizations had taken. The same miscalculation, the same confidence that the act of exclusion would define the excluded. It does not. It never has. The record is clear on this if the record is read. I am Halvard Osen, Archivist 2nd Tier, Commission for the Preservation of Interstellar Historical Record. I have catalogued the warnings of 6 dead empires and submitted them to a 7th body that voted as if the record did not exist. I have watched in the years since as the 7th body has begun to reproduce, in miniature, the same pattern of extended declarations, accumulated questions, and slowly dawning uncertainty that the terminal records describe. I have done what archivists do. I have kept the record. The record is the record. Whatever comes next is already in it, if you know how to read it. I am reading it still.